Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the fourth of the ERM offshore wind webinars that is today going to be focused on Taiwan. We've got two very interesting presentations today from the technical perspective and the environmental and social perspective. But first, I'll introduce what's happening today to everyone who's joining. And I will run over a few slides I have, which talk about general trends which are appropriate to what we're discussing today about Taiwan. So I'm Sean Purdy. I'm the lead for power for Asia Pacific for ERM. So one of the interesting things that we'd like to talk about, or in my announcements, is that RCG will be presenting on the technical side of project delivery. RCG is now a fully owned subsidiary of ERM. Historically, ERM has been fully focused on environmental, social, and health and safety, plus sustainability. With the acquisition of RCG, a specialist technical advisory firm, we can now provide the package of feasibility studies, technical and environmental due diligence, etc., associated with the development of renewables. So the other thing is the other good news is that this is as I said, the fourth webinar, and we're going to take some of the things we learned and some of the inputs from the previous webinars, Korea, Japan, and China, into this webinar today. Though obviously the focus and the vast majority of the comments will be relevant to Taiwan. If you do want to see some of the slides or from the other presentations, the other webinars, reach out to one of the contacts that you'll see in our presentation. Next slide, please. So first up, an introduction by myself, then the round 3 Trilemma from RCG, two presenters from RCG who I'll introduce shortly, then followed by a presentation from ERM on offshore wind environmental risks. We've got a button at the bottom here where you can ask your questions at any stage. We've got plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so we'll open it to the floor. Anybody who'd like to ask a question, just type it up. I'm sure you've seen it before on Zoom. So we encourage active participation. As I mentioned, please ask questions and we'll discuss them at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will only be used for ERM internal purposes. However, the presentation material will be available after the completion of this webinar and will automatically be sent to participants and registrants for this webinar. We've enabled the English transcript feature, so simply click at the bottom and you can get English subtitles coming across this presentation. Then there'll be some final wrap-up comments from me, and then everybody can hopefully finish for the day or finish answering the emails and other communications that have come in. Next slide, please. So everyone's excited about renewable energy, regulators, governments, equipment suppliers, developers, financial institutions, etc. And the major comment I want to make here is COVID obviously has affected the world, but it's hurting, but not halting the global renewable energy growth. Despite some economic uncertainties, kickstart financing, sovereign support for infrastructure, a big chunk of it is going to be focused and continue to be focused and invested in renewable area. So the latest projections are globally, there'll be renewable capacity additions on track for a record expansion of nearly 10% in 2021. In part, that's the real reason why we're having this webinar. It's so much is happening in renewables, and proportionally even more is happening in offshore wind. Some of the developments, some of the opportunities were almost unthinkable 3 years ago in this part of the world. And obviously it's a very interesting time to be involved in this area. Next slide. Just some comments. We all appreciate that the size of wind farm developments is increasing. The range of technology is improving, and the commerciality and reliability of that new technology is improving. And also, obviously, the total height of wind turbines. And we've got some projections there of what will happen in 2030. So what does that actually mean? It means more issues associated with flight paths, more issues associated with bird monitoring. Not all bad news on the migratory bird side, because if the turbines themselves are placed further away from each other, there's more gaps between them. Next, safety, increasing concentration needed on safety as the wind turbine facilities get further offshore, get further away from technical connection, and the size and construction vessels required to build them increase. So safety is going to be an increasing part of what's happening in offshore wind. Comment I'll make is that projections for investment in offshore oil and gas by 2030, market expenditure, so not just capital expenditure, all types of expenditure, offshore oil and gas are projected to grow slightly by 2030 to 140 billion, 140. Offshore wind market expenditure is projected to grow to 87 billion. So obviously behind, but very much closing the gap with offshore oil and gas. Next slide, please. So offshore wind and renewables is not just about producing electricity. I'd say we've all been bombarded with media announcements and development announcements for hydrogen and green hydrogen. And the jury might be out to some people whether green hydrogen can compete with other forms of fuel. But I think it's fair to say that more and more people are believing that green hydrogen will be a solution to decarbonisation requirements, or part of the solution anyway. And next, my last slide. I mentioned safety before. The latest details we have in 2020, the offshore wind industry experienced 198 high potential incidents with the possibility of death or life-changing injury. And certainly, again, what anyone at a senior level, a CEO level, wherever, doesn't want to see anything associated with death or injury on any of the projects they're developing. So this is an area that will have to be integrated as into your development process as the developments continue. All right, that's probably enough from me. My next job is to introduce our first two presenters from RCG. Firstly, Laura will start, and then Wen will continue. So Laura Evertson is a director based in RCG's office in Taipei in Taiwan. She has more than 15 years experience in the energy industry, centered mostly on renewable energy. She has led multifaceted teams to deliver large infrastructure projects from conception through to operation, and has particular experience in divestment, business strategy, and transformation. She'll be followed by Qingwen Huang. Wen is a principal based in RCG's office in Taipei in Taiwan. He is an analyst supporting both market intelligence and technical advisory work across all renewable energy technologies. Mr. Huang's background is in sustainability consulting, focusing on the energy sector and information and communications technology industries. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Sean, for the introduction. As Sean said, I'm Laura Evertson, and I head up the RCG office here in Taiwan. If we could go to the next slide, please. So for those of you that aren't familiar with RCG, just a bit about our background. If we go to the next slide, please. So RCG is a purely renewables consultancy. We were founded in 2015. And in 2018, the Taiwan office was opened along with an office in Tokyo. And we have grown ever since 2018 with the growth of the offshore wind industry here in Taiwan. Across the world, RCG has about 60 people. And as Sean said, we were acquired by ERM earlier this year. And we're really pleased to be able to be working with ERM today as providing this first joint webinar from Taiwan. And we hope that it's the first of many. So if we go on to the next slide, and I'll introduce what I'm talking about today. So I'm going to talk about the third round trilemma. And if we go to the next slide, please, I'll explain what that means. So Taiwan is seeing rapid growth and expansion in its offshore wind industry. And as the name suggests, it's now entering into its third round. And there are a few challenges that RCG views as kind of main issues in this rapid growth of the industry here. And that's what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start by talking about localization. And then I'm going to hand over to Wen to talk about bid price ceiling and also the capacity cap for the third round. And as you will see later on in the presentation, there is a linkage between all three of these points. So going on to the next slide, I'm going to start to talk about the localization policy. So what exactly is localization? I know in many other jurisdictions, we refer to it as local content. But essentially, it's a prioritization of locally sourced, manufactured, or delivered components for a wind farm. And why is it so important for Taiwan? Well, politically, it's been very important for Taiwan to maintain a very low electricity price. And in recent months and weeks, there's been a bigger focus on having a greener energy market here. And so there's more and more political pressure to continue to deliver that cheap energy, but to deliver benefits, obviously, to the Taiwan economy. So the government obviously wishes to improve its own local economy and to be seen as an economy that is advancing in technology development, and also to create a regional hub for offshore wind projects. So not just focusing on Taiwan, but the rest of the Asia Pacific region. That's really important politically for Taiwan to be able to deliver that. And on the right-hand side of the slide here, just a reminder really of the size of the prize. So the third round for offshore wind, the target has been set at 15 gigawatts. And phase one of that, which is the auctions that we're heading towards, is actually 9 gigawatts. And you can see that there's a 3 gigawatt allocation for each stage. And what's important to note from this ambition here, and it will become obvious in later slides why it's important to mention it, is that there's only a 500 megawatt allocation per developer. So just keep that in mind because it becomes important later on. So why is Taiwan so stringent in its approach to localization? So I think unlike a number of other nations, Taiwan is looking at about 90% of all wind farm components to be covered by local suppliers. Now, this is much more than a number of the Western developers are used to. And I guess it gives Taiwan control over where a lot of the foreign investment is going. So predominantly it is Western developers here in Taiwan at the moment, but Taiwan is trying very hard to actually prioritize its own developers, but also its own supply chain. So it's trying to create a policy which allows local suppliers to invest now for future opportunity. So going on to the next slide, you know, as we have seen in other industries and other countries where offshore wind is perhaps a little bit slow to get off the ground initially in terms of policy, like it might be lacking in detailed policy. Obviously, as the number of rounds progress, that policy is developed and experience is gained, which leads government and the consenting authorities, etc., to actually provide more stringent policies going forward. And exactly the same has happened in terms of of Taiwan's localization obligations. So you can see in the table at the bottom of the slide for the second round projects, whilst there were some obligations on some of the key wind turbine components, you can see the number of additional components increasing with the later projects. So you're looking at 14 additional components that have to be locally sourced compared to the early second round projects, which didn't have any. And in order to actually prove localization has been considered, it actually is now a case of having to provide formal contracts as part of the auction. Excuse me, and that's something that, again, hasn't been required up until now in Taiwan. So there's a real focus on early engagement with suppliers, and not just engagement, but actually having some kind of formal contract in place. So the table at the top here shows the complexity, really, the flow chart here of exactly what is required for the third round. So there's different categories which essentially outline a number of different components that have to be locally sourced, or for which a percentage of the items or the capacity of the project have to be locally sourced. And then in addition to those compulsory items, there's also optional items. And it's very complex in that a number of points are assigned to each item and the number of points vary. But the idea is that the developers are able to actually calculate what they believe their localization score to be ahead of the auction. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see why that's important. So the process for the auction is really important to understand here. So essentially, it's a two-stage auction process which scores the performance of the developer. And only in the event that equal bids are submitted in terms of price in stage 2, do we then have a stage 3 and stage 4. So in order to qualify for the auction in the third round, a developer needs to be able to meet the criteria for technical and financial capability, and they need to score at least 70 points on those items in order to proceed. In addition to that capability review, the developer needs to actually be able to meet the localization requirements. So it is a prerequisite for the auction. And there are also additional bonus points available if a developer goes above and beyond the compulsory items for localization. So once a developer has actually pre-qualified, then the developer will submit its price. And in the event that there's a lowest price, it's obvious, therefore, that a developer will take on the site that it is bid for. In the event that developers all submit the same price, then there will be another decider which goes back to the localization score, and the developer with the highest score will then be the one that will be awarded the site in the auction. So it's very, very important that from a localization perspective, the developer not only qualifies, but has the highest possible score in the event that the bid price is exactly the same. Now, if you remember earlier, I referred to this capacity cap of 500 megawatts per project, per developer. In order to have, developers a level playing field, you'll need to have 6 developers all submitting the same price. Now, when my colleague will go on to talk about this in a minute, because it is highly likely that developers will put in a 0 bid. So if you have multiple developers all putting in a 0 bid, then of course there is a chance that there will be a greater focus on the localization score, as that will be what will determine the outcome of the auction. We go to the next slide, please. So there's a number of issues with localization that we've already seen in the previous rounds, where the actual requirements are a lot less than they're going to be for the third round. So we've already seen issues with local suppliers not being able to meet the health and safety requirements that are set predominantly by the Western developers. They're not recognized by international standards, certifications, and also, they're struggling to provide for wind farms and wind turbines at the current size. And as that as the turbine size increases, as Sean alluded to earlier, the requirements are going to get harder to meet in terms of space requirements and materials. So there's already issues with localization, and these are going to need to be addressed if we're to stand a chance of meeting the requirements for the third round. So in terms of quantity, there's also been issues with supply. So developers that have already committed to meet localization have struggled to do that. So for example, Ørsted's Greater Changhua project had committed to provide foundations from Singdao Marine, a local supplier, and they weren't able to do that. And they actually ended up going to Korea to actually fulfill their order. So there were some exceptions made, and they worked very closely with government to obviously have a workaround, but essentially they haven't met the localization obligations that they initially committed to. So, we're already seeing issues, and for the third round, there'll be 3 gigawatts added every 2 years. So local suppliers really need to grow and improve if they're to be able to deliver on this policy. It's not just something that the developers have to focus on. In terms of other risks, it's inevitably going to increase the price because local developers have to invest now in order to be able to meet demand. And it will be a few years before we start to see that price decreasing. With the different combinations of suppliers, I think it's going to be very hard to actually predict what the levelized cost of energy will be for each of these projects. So we're not looking at standardization now of these projects. They're all going to be quite different. And the government has actually been quite slow in confirming what the localization requirements are, which makes it quite difficult for suppliers to catch up. We've lost a few months this year whilst we were waiting for the policy, and developers that are intending to bid into the first auction next year, they need to do a lot now in terms of engaging with suppliers to be able to put the contracts in place. So I just wanted to end by adding another complexity, which is vessels. So in addition to the localization requirements for the components of the wind turbines, the wind farm, and also some engineering design services, there's also a requirement to prioritize local vessels. And there's a list there of the types of vessels that this includes. And again, this is something that's been very difficult to comply with so far. And again, I think is going to just become more and more difficult as we kind of develop more and more projects. So there's a very strict process to follow with vessels in terms of getting approval for which vessel a project intends to use. And again, there are some ways around it if there are no local vessels available. There are some approvals that can be obtained in order to use foreign vessels. But essentially, the focus of the Taiwanese government is very much on providing local vessels, local suppliers for all of its projects going forward. So that completes my section on localization. If we go on to the next slide, please. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Wen, who will talk about the other 2 items in the trilemma.
So yeah, next slide, please. Thank you, Laura. I think now people briefly understand the general policy for surround offshore wind development auction in Taiwan. And the second very important thing I think that everybody care about is the price. Of course, when you're doing this project, you want to develop your project, the project financing things. The price is always the fundamental issue for each of the project. And now, according to the current policy, the price have been set the ceiling for that, which is 2.49 Taiwanese dollars per kilowatt hours. That is about 67 or 66 euro for megawatt hours. So it's actually quite low. This actually limits the flexibility for any kind of project development and the strategy, and they will definitely affect other factors in the Trilemma. Like, for example, what Laura talked about, about the local content requirement. Of course, that if the government set out the rules for developers to purchase the stuff from the local supply chain, that's fine. But always, as Taiwan are not don't have too much experience on this industry, somebody are still on their learning curve, the price would be higher, and which means you need much more investment. But if just think about this ceiling price layer, then which make the developer hard for their negotiation with the supply chain. On the other hand, you think about the cap. Of course, everybody know about the scale, the economic of scale. So if you be allocated much more capacity for your wind farm, which means you can do all those contract agreement business together, and increase your efficiencies, which make you can lower your cost, then probably is helping for your bidding price. But yeah, but eventually there's two things are all affected. So let's go to the next page for further detail of the bid price ceiling. And yeah, that is a lot of information here. I think for every developer here now in Taiwan, no matter it's an existing developer or a newcomer, this kind of ceiling requirement is, never seen before in other markets, and that actually limits their option for their project finance. And people are getting worried about, oh, how can I develop my project at this low price, and how can I secure the return of my project? That's of course the things, and echoing what Laura just mentioned, the local government have a stringent requirement for each of the policies and the expectation from the general public. We can look into the right-hand side, that's the general electricity price. In Taiwan, the button is the electricity sale price in Taiwan. You can see it for the average one, and for the industrial sale price or the household sales price. That's actually at about 2.5 to 3 Taiwanese dollar per kilowatt hours level. But if you look into the upper part, it's the fixed rate for different main renewable energies. Before that, the offshore wind is at about $5 Taiwanese dollar level, and under the pressure of the public to have a lower electricity price, the government keep lowering that. Now it's about in 2021, it's about 4.65 level Taiwanese dollar per kilowatt hours. And compared to solar, it's still good. So solar is about 3.7, 3.8, 3.7, or about 4. It depends on different technology applied for. But now, because of the pressure from the public, the government also want to push the offshore wind to a more liberalized market. So it's basically set out this ceiling price requirement for bidding. So which means all of those things, you either join the bidding at really low price, or you have to secure your CPPA, which is corporate power procurement agreement with other off-takers, the industry in Taiwan, who will purchase the green energy from you. And if you get a better price, then it's actually secure your return for your project before the auction. So now I talk about the before the auction issue for all of the project, because now the developer facing this situation, I cannot secure my price in the future by the government bidding tariff or the bidding, because the bidding price is too low. Bidding ceiling price is too low, so they need to looking for the off-taker in the market, maybe have a higher price, then they can make sure their project is feasible in the future. But it's a totally fundamental change for all the developers. I believe there's a lot of experienced developers here in Taiwan, but they are asking the same question. They maybe have the experience for CPPA before, but they don't have the experience before the auction. At the moment, they don't have any kind of development right, but they have to sign, no matter it's kind of MOU or conditional project, a conditional contract with the potential off-taker. And equally, in parallel, the off-taker are kind of confused, because normally if you are TSMC or any large company in Taiwan, then you need to sign a contract with Taipower, Taiwan Power Company, then it's quite a simple thing for you. But now you have to sign a contract with a green energy developer, or the project or the site that haven't seen, and that probably will not win the development rights in the end. So it's all risky for no matter developer or off-taker, and which this bring the really challenge for everybody in the market. And it's quite new here. People still try to figure out how to do that. And yeah, there's a lot of discussion. So also for this discussion, that people are also mentioned about like zero bidding, which means, okay, the government already set out the ceiling at so low level. So which means I will not following this. I will probably just submit zero, and no matter how I will sign this VPA with others, maybe at $3, $4, or better $5, that secure my return in the future. And that zero bidding doesn't make sense for me anyway, and I can still make my project feasible. But which means following the policy itself, because the government say that the selling price now for 2022 auction is 2.49, and they will use the weighted average of previous auction winner for their next auction. So if there are more than one developer submit zero in 2022, then we can expect that in 2023 auction or 2024 auction, the selling price will become lower. That which means it doesn't make sense anymore. It's people just pushing people to have lower and lower price for their project, and that make the developer much more nervous about this mechanism, and they need to find out the right partner for their project with the CPPA. Yeah. Next slide, please. And then let's talk about a cap. Again, back to the Trilemma itself. We already talked about the localization requirement, talk about the ceiling price, and now its location, as Laura just mentioned, it's 500 megawatt per each wind farm, and it's 500 megawatts as well for each developer in each auction. So we have 3 auctions happened in 2022, 2023, and 2024, which means each developer will only have 1.5 gigawatt capacity in this solar development phases. And so that actually limits the flexibility and option. That which means no matter how good I am as a developer, I can only win 1.5 gigawatts. And when I sign the contract with no matter the developer, the supply chain, I can only promise 1.5 gigawatts at most, and which lower the economic of sale again either. And also for the bid price, because they could not secure their return, they cannot plan everything in the very beginning, because it's kind of uncertainty for them to secure how many capacity they will win in the auction. So go much detail into the next slide. Before that, let's look into how the competition now in Taiwan. You can see the map here. There's a lot of wind farm already dropped on the Taiwan Sea, Taiwan Strait water. And by recently, the beginning of December, RWE just announced their 5 new projects for EIA, which means now are more than 46 gigawatt project about to join the auction, or they are under their EIA process. And that's a lot of projects compete with each other. But some projects are at large size, like maybe they rise to 2.5 gigawatt or like 1.8 gigawatt, and some projects are rising 600 megawatt or 500 megawatt. But no matter how, according to what I say, the cap is there. Each one can have 500 megawatts in each round. So it's difficult, like even the competition is here, and compared to its 46 gigawatt and the 9 gigawatt target of the government, it's kind of unfair for each other to compete in this situation. And go to the next slide. So what's really a fact for all of this development? That think about the 500 for each wind farm, and if you are a developer, you have rise 2 gigawatt wind farm in the sea, but you can only win 500 megawatt in each round. That is also you already find from the map that a lot of projects are overlapped with each other. So if I can only take 500 in this round, somebody else will take another 500 or more. at the same site. So even I raise the 2 gigawatt wind farm, eventually I can only have 500 megawatt or less for my project. So it's quite risky. And also this larger wind farm will be divided into pieces. Probably at the best, it could be 500 megawatt for each. But if the developer are not cooperating with each other, or in a rational situation, probably somebody will only have like 300 megawatt or 200 megawatt just because the design of their layout for the wind farm. So it's quite difficult and risky, and nobody has the guarantee for integrated development. That's also challenges echoing what I talked about, the bid price, the cost, and the localization requirement. Even you have the larger wind farm on your plan, but it's just a paper on your decks. Eventually you have to see what's the result of the competition, and that's the real amount you need to order from the supply chain, and they have to rethink about your project finance after the auction. And yeah, of course, I already mentioned about the economic of scale so several times, and it's hard for you to negotiate with each other because you only have 500 megawatt at most each time, and nobody knows who will win for the next time. And also, let's talk about the pieces things. Now, because the government set out 3 gigawatt target for each auction, like for in 2022 or 2023, each round will be allocated 3 gigawatt capacity. But each developer will have 500 megawatt at most, which means they will probably have 6 winners for each round. But here comes the question: do we really have so much developer now in the markets that can join each of the auction? If there's no enough developer, which means even somebody like unqualified developer have the chance to win no matter 500 or 300 megawatts. This is not quite good for the market, and people still need to figure out how to do with that. That's the challenges for this whole market. And yeah, as people are thinking in this way, so, and also regarding this kind of intense competition, people now need to talk with each other or have the better strategy for your wind farm layout design, and also for your whole planning for all of your auction strategy. Okay, so next slide, please. I will just take this example as some supporting reference for what my talking. In the left side is a Greater Changhua project from State for second round. So it's actually about 2.4 gigawatts as the total potential capacity for this 4 sites. And after the site application of second round, they kind of secure their right for this 4 sites, and they can, do the EIA properly and join the auction to see how far they can go, how much capacity they win won from this wind farm. And in the end, they got really good results, so they can negotiate with the government, with the supply chain, with all of their contractor to plan how to develop those wind farms. Some of the sites are be allocated with the feed-in tariff at a higher price. Some of them are win with the bidding from with the bidding at lower price, but they signed a CPA with TSMC. So we can say that it's actually still good for them to plan this as a whole and secure the return, the expected return for their project. But now the situation for third round, you can look into the right side. Like I grabbed the wind farms in Taichung waters. That's about, we can say, 2.5 gigawatt potential in this waters area. But there are also 5 developers looking onto the same side, propose their project overlapping with each other. And everybody are playing their layout by themselves, and nobody will know who will be the winner after 2022 or 2023 or even later. So, imagine that if somebody drove the wind farm in the central of this triangle, and it will rule the others, will impact the others' plan. But, we can only see who is the winner and talk with each other. And it's actually making it much more chaotic situation, because yes, we've got good potential for those wind farms in Taiwan's trade water, but the current rules are encouraging competition. Of course, it's good in the perspective of liberalized market, but it's kind of too intensive. So without the certain rules, and each this larger area will be separated into pieces from different developer, and it's kind of waste the good potential in this area, and probably the cable, the wind farm layout itself will be much more difficult for the developer to plan that properly in advance. So that's all will reflect to what I talked about, like bidding price, like supply chain, like nobody can plan things at this kind of uncertainty and risk. But now is the situation. So we will say you must do whatever, like what I mentioned, CPPA, or with a proper local engagement with the supply chain to secure your plan, to make your plan be more flexible, to have more optional, and talk to the right stakeholder for your project planning. That is my part, and I will hand it back to Laura for our conclusion.
Thank you, Wen. So really, if you just go on to the next slide, just in summary for the RCG element of this presentation, obviously, aside from the trilemma, there are a number of other issues that developers have to consider. And most are not a surprise to experienced developers, and nor are they specific to Taiwan. However, understanding the local approach to these issues is very important. And Jovi will cover some of these issues in the next presentation. Needless to say, I'm very reticent that I don't want to paint a negative picture here, because a number of developers see the huge offshore wind potential here in Taiwan, and we are very excited about what the next few years is going to bring. And back to Sean. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Wen. And next slide, please. We're going to have something a little different now, which is an audience poll. This question refers to the 4 jurisdictions that we have our webinars in. And the question is, where do you see the most activity for your company in the next 12 months in the 4 places that we've had, ERM RCG have had their webinars? I suspect Taiwan might be fairly high up there, but please, if you could click on one of the 4 options, and we'll have a look at what the answers are in a minute or so. I think that's sort of what we would have expected. A lot of people attending this call are very interested in Taiwan, but there's still a very large amount of activity happening in Japan and Korea. So we'll now go on to the next question. No one from ERM or RCG can vote in this, so we ask all our attendees if they could please vote. The next biggest offshore wind opportunity for your company in the next 12 months. And I'll also let you know which countries on this list won in our previous webinars. Once we get our answer here. Okay, so Vietnam came out ahead there, and India was no votes, but I think that is quite relevant as well. Vietnam, obviously, a number of international developers looking at Vietnam. They've probably got some experience already in onshore wind or solar. I suspect we might see a little bit more interest in Australia in the medium-term future because of the new seabed legislation that's been passed here by the federal government. So just to let you know, the Korea result of this question had Australia ranked #1. The Japan webinar had Vietnam again ranked #1, and China also had Vietnam ranked #1. So I think you're spot on, most of the people there, with your predictions. Okay, we're going to go on now to our second presentation. This presentation is going to be by Jovi Tam, my colleague Jovi, with over 15 years experience as an ERM partner. He specializes in environmental and social impact assessment, 15 years with ERM, recently promoted to partner. Environmental and social impact assessment, environmental monitoring and audits, as well as environmental and social due diligence of major resource or infrastructure development projects. And I would say that increasingly he'll be involved in joint work we do with a technical perspective with RCG. His extensive EHS consulting experience with the renewable energy sector, including offshore wind, onshore wind, solar and hydropower development, and is highly familiar with the IFC performance standard and Equator Principles, latest versions of Equator Principles. Over to you, Jovi.
Thank you, Sean. Hello, everyone. I'm Jovi Tam. I'm the Office Managing Partner of ERM Taiwan. So following RCG introduction of the offshore wind Trilemma in Taiwan, I'm going to talk about the environmental and social risk related to the coming auction and subsequent implementation of the offshore wind project in Taiwan. I'm going to firstly talk about the environmental impact assessment, EIA, that you need to do and get approval before the auction, and also the post-auction implementation of projects during which the successful bidder may lead to address environmental risk related to design change, and we have talked about that many times here, project financing. So before I move on to talk about my topic of environmental and social risk, let me spend a few seconds to introduce my company, ERM, and what we do for Taiwan. Next slide, please. So ERM, we are the largest pure-play sustainability consultant in the world. We have established for 50 years, providing consulting services related to environment, social, health and safety and risk. We have offices in more than 40 countries, including here in Taiwan. So, I mean, locally in Taiwan, over the past 4 years, we have been working for a lot of offshore wind developers for the last auction, as well as for the coming round 3. Our service covered ENS support for project financing, ENS risk screening for site selection, environmental impact assessment, as well as management system development and implementation. So very relevant to today's topic. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mean, let's move on to talk about the first topic of my session today, which is the environmental impact assessment, EIA, in Taiwan. So, I mean, I think many of you are familiar with EIA, or in some places called ESIA or ESHIA, depending on the scope, whether it covers social impact and also health impact. So, I mean, EIA is very often linked to environmental impact, environmental permit that you need to get before the development of offshore wind project. And it is the same here in Taiwan. According to Taiwan regulations, you have to do an EIA for offshore wind projects. And further to that, the draft guidelines published by the BOE require that, you know, the developer have an approved EIA in order to be qualified to participate in the third round auction. So actually, unlike many other countries, investment in EIA of offshore wind projects come much earlier, before auction in Taiwan. For many countries, you only need to do an EIA and get approval after the auction. So let's look at what you need to do before the auction for the EIA then. Sorry, previous slide. Yep, let's look at the flow chart here. On the right-hand side, you need to publish your development activities plan to tell people basic information about your project and the EIA that you're going to do. As for typical EIA, you need to conduct baseline assessment, do your impact assessment, and recommend measures to control your impacts to an acceptable level that would be agreed by the regulator and the key stakeholders, so that you get your EIA approved. So all these findings will be presented in a document called Affirmative Impact Statement, EIS, which will be published for the public to comment. And then after you adjust the public comments, you will then submit the EIS to BOE, and BOE, after you meet certain conditions, they will pass it to the EPA for the review and approval process. So typically, EIA is an 18 to 24 months program in Taiwan, which would create time pressure for your awesome preparation, which is coming in 2022 and 2023, and further 2024. Next slide, please. So, why EIA takes so long to complete and get approval? What's involved and what is the critical process or milestone? A key part of the answer is that the EIA need to include extensive baseline survey requirement, which range from 10 to 12 months, that need to cover key sensitive receivers. In Taiwan here, a lot of emphasis have been placed on wind farm impacts to bird and marine mammals. So for both of them, they need to do survey covering 4 seasons, and in each season, you have to do multiple survey trips. Apart from birds, bats, marine mammal, you also need to cover other marine and fishery resources, such as marine and intertidal ecological survey, marine water quality and sediment quality survey. And in addition to the marine component, you have to do some onshore survey to cover your onshore development component, such as the onshore cable route and substation. And you have to do, again, terrestrial ecological survey and some environmental physical surveys, such as noise, air quality, surface water quality, electromagnetic field survey, etc. A lot that you need to do. And for round 3, we expected that the EPA and the EIA review committee will expect more surveys to be done due to their concern on the impacts to this key sensitive receiver. So, as you can see, the survey requirement is very extensive, and many of these are marine surveys that are often affected by weather downtime, in particular during this time of the year, from November to January, which is the monsoon season, which pose further time pressure to your EIA. However, it is very important to manage your program. However, we cannot control weather. So what else we should do to avoid other factors affecting your program? Next slide, please. So we have mentioned that for several times already, health and safety. So actually, once you get your survey mobilized, everything will be relatively straightforward if you have engaged a technically qualified consultant to help you with the survey. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of QA/QC, the survey and findings itself, and you need to engage a suitable consultant to do that. However, what I would like to highlight here is from our on-the-ground experience, it could be a blind spot if you first enter Taiwan market, is how important is health and safety planning required to avoid further delay to your program, in addition to weather downtime. Many of us, in particular, if you have offshore background, or if you're offshore wind developer, would know that marine activities such as the survey that we are doing that require offshore works on a vessel pose significant health and safety risk that are of concern, that can lead to consequence of minor injury to multiple fatality. Robust health and safety planning and implementation is therefore very important to avoid incident, delay of your survey mobilization and implementation. Many of you would already have robust company procedure that are ready to be imposed to your EIA contractor to ensure their safety performance, This include what I listed here, right? The job hazard analysis, GHA, emergency response plan, vessel inspection program, management of change, staff training, and offshore work training, and fitness to work, etc. But however, while your procedures are here, the challenge is whether the EIA contractor really understand these procedures and the rationale behind them and can comply with them. Let me give a few examples of what we have seen. For example, while the EIA contractor may know that they have to do JHA, job hazard analysis, look at the risk and the control measures. You may just receive a JHA that covers risk such as traveling on a vessel with the control measures of like wearing life jacket and procedures of men overboard, risk related to other survey tasks on the vessel, such as towing of equipment, use of heavy equipment such as winch, lifting can be missing. It is because while they understand your procedure of JHA, they do not understand the task I mentioned are relevant risk. Another example is that the EIA contractor may be using vessels that the Taiwan regulations do not require them to have the life raft on board, which are very often essential to have under many company offshore work procedures. So imagine if you find that missing during your survey mobilization, it could take a long time for you to get back the equipment you need and mobilize your survey. And we have seen delayed not days, but months due to this. So even if you have conveyed your safety requirement to the EIA contractor, please do not assume they understand them. What we would recommend is communicate these requirements to them earlier. For example, when you're requesting the proposal, and look at how they really propose to adjust your procedures. It is very important for you to do this in order to make sure that the survey can be mobilized smoothly and implemented safely. Next slide, please. Okay, all right. So, I've talked about the survey, and let's assume, you have done what you need to do. You have mobilized your survey successfully, and it's progressing well, safely, giving you the data. You then need to use this data to undertake your assessment, look at your project impact, and also recommend measures to control these impacts. Findings will be presented in the EIS Affirmative Impact Statement that you have to send to BOE, who will then help you to pass to EPA for review and approval. To achieve this, you have a challenging schedule before auction, but yet you still need to address key stakeholder concerns, which is the EIA Review Committee for the EIA approval, and that create further pressure. Expectation from the review committee are expected to be higher than before. They may want more intense survey requirement, as I have mentioned. They are concerned on potential impacts on key species, including birds and marine mammals, and as such, they may require more stringent mitigation and monitoring requirements, which will affect the cost and schedule of your project. So for the coming slide, I select two keystone species in Taiwan, which are the bat-faced spoonbill and Taiwanese white dolphin that offshore projects often encounter, to explain about the species concern and the stringent mitigation requirement. Actually, these two species are superstar in Taiwan. So for wind projects here, the stakeholder concerns are bird strike, displacement, and cumulative impact due to the large number of concurrent projects. And you got internationally concerned endangered species such as the bat-faced spoonbill present in Taiwan. It is listed as endangered by the IUCN Red List. As such, to address the bird collision risk and cumulative impacts, the EIA commitment made for previous round 2 EIA is the provision of bird flight corridor between wind farms, as you can see on the figure on the right-hand side, shown by the orange and yellow lines, and also commitment on turbine speed reduction and temporary shutdown are also made. So looking that the developers have been working really hard since the commitment to develop the shutdown mechanism. So this mitigation would obviously affect your power generation and profit. For Taiwanese white dolphin, I mean, in the world, there is less than 80 individuals, probably less than 60s. So, and this Taiwanese white dolphin can only be found on the western coastline of Taiwan, as shown in the light blue area of the figure on the lower right-hand bottom, where all the offshore wind farm development being located. So the large-scale development of the offshore wind farm, over hundreds and maybe thousands of turbines coming, will generate prolonged underwater noise impact to marine mammals subject to turbine location, and such impacts may affect marine mammals, including Taiwanese white dolphin, which is a critically endangered species, leading to increasing risk of injury and temporary displacement of this species. Next slide, please. So given the presence of these key species, the EIA committee may continue to look for stringent mitigation and monitoring requirements. So from previous round 2 experience, examples of these measures include what I've just described: turbine speed reduction and temporary shutdown to reduce bird collision impact, and also piling underwater noise mitigation to mitigate impacts of marine mammal, and the level is quite difficult to achieve from what we understand. So, but these measures, when it is committed, you will need to implement them. Otherwise, there may be financial penalty or even stop work requirement. What we have seen in round 2 is that wind farm is relatively new for Taiwan, so that the stakeholders may not understand too much about the feasibility of this mitigation. And due to the tight schedule of the auction, you have to get it approved before auction. You don't have too much time to bargain on this requirement. So maybe you say that, the key stakeholder should now have learned, right? Have more experience, know what's technically feasible or not. I agree. But even if that is the case, you may be bringing in new technology, such as floating design, that can lead to the same challenges. So what we suggest here is to have your assessment well prepared for that. A lesson learned from round 2 is that although the baseline done are very comprehensive, the assessment is very inadequate, generally just a few paragraphs to describe the impacts. Certain impacts are also overlooked. For example, potential impacts to Taiwanese white dolphin due to cable laying and movement of vessels. So, I mean, the stakeholder, therefore, they don't have enough information to rely on, leading to mitigation requirements on a conservative side. So for round 3, we would recommend the assessment to be briefed up and be prepared to explain the mitigation you suggest or not suggest based on international wind farm experience and technical feasibility. You also need to make sure that you have good communication with your consultant, having them to consider your constraint and impacts to your cost and program related to the mitigations they proposed. Help to look at problematic project design that require attention, and to help you to identify cost-effective solution for your construction and operation. For example, when considering the cable route, you should try to minimize overlap with the Taiwanese white dolphin habitat. Otherwise, you have to use the expensive horizontal directional drilling method to lay your cable to minimize your impact. You should also allow a bigger design envelope to avoid design change later on. And I'm going to explain why in the next couple of minutes. So these are the challenges that you have to face for the preparation and approval of the EIA. Next slide. But then, I mean, again, let's be positive. Assume, congratulations, you complete your EIA in the shortest possible time frame and get approved. You won the auction. What's next? Is your project free from environmental and social risk already? Absolutely not. There are still 2 things that you will need to consider which may affect your project implementation, which are the environmental differential assessment for design change and social and environmental social requirements related to project financing. Next slide. So Let's look at EDA. For Taiwan EIA, as I've mentioned, it is done before auction, which means that you based your EIA on an early design for your impact assessment. So design is likely to evolve with better technology. For example, larger turbine that allows you to generate more power between the time of EIA preparation and auction award, which is more than a year. So if design changes could cause changes in potential environmental impact, then the process called environmental differential assessment, EDA, may be triggered according to Taiwan regulations. Next slide. This figure, the flowchart on the left-hand side, illustrates the Taiwan EDA process, assuming there is a design change leading to changes in environmental impacts. First thing you should notice is the timeline on the left-hand side. So the approval can take up to 6 to 18 months. That is not statutory timeline. That is what we have seen from real example. And before you get your EDA approved, you have to stick to your original design present in the EIA. So like EIA, you will need to submit the EDA for review, and there could be several rounds of preliminary review before the EDA go to the EPA committee panel review, which can be again 2 to 3 rounds. EDA seems unavoidable. As you can see on the table of the left-hand side, we list the examples of cases involving EDA that actually involve a lot, if not all of the wind farms for round 2. Next slide. So the table I put here provides some further information about the review and time required for approval of the EDA. I highlight that in red. Remember, this only talk about the review and approval of the EDA, not about the preparation of the EDA itself, which may lead baseline survey to be done to inform the assessment. So second and third column, multiple rounds of review from 3 to 8 rounds. And the fourth column, the days for approval can be up to from 100 to up to 481 days. That's a lot. And actually, on the last column, during the EDA process, you may need to commit to additional mitigation and monitoring measures. Examples are listed here that may include increase in monitoring duration, scope, personnel involved, or commitment to adopt new mitigation technology. Next slide. So to avoid EDA or reduce time need for EDA, it has to be planned during the EIA stage. Again, you have to communicate with your consultant to make sure that the EIA has maximized design envelope, which allow flexibility of design and avoid or reduce time need for an EDA. The table here gives examples present for round 1 and round 2 projects for rotor swap height, which are related to berth collision risk. And you can see ranges or envelope of blade diameter and hub height are present. A recent EDA case presents a large envelope of blade diameter from 164 meter to 250 meter, which allows flexibility for design changes later. So consider the design envelope in your EIA early. Next slide. Okay, so following discussion of EDA, which are related to your project financing during implementation, my last topic is on environmental and social requirements for project financing, which are at least equally important, and project financing has been mentioned for several times already. So when we talk about project financing requirement, I refer to Equator Principle EP, not just because it is good practice, it is because for all the project financing project we handled in Taiwan for offshore wind, they are complying with EP. So brief introduction, Equator Principle is launched in 2003 and now is evolved to the 4th version, EP4. It is a voluntary risk management framework that many international financial institutes adopt to manage the environmental and social risk when financing projects. So currently, 126 finance institutes in 30 countries adopt the Equator Principle, including banks in Taiwan. Next one. So there are 10 equator principles, and I'm going to focus on principle 2 to 3 only. So if you're interested in other principle, we can arrange a separate discussion. Please give a click. So under EP2, projects are required to undertake an environmental and social impact assessment. So let's call it International Environmental and Social Impact Assessment, International ESIA. And according to EP4, the requirement on international ESIA are not just referred to host country law, but also IFC Performance Standard, IFCPS, and World Bank Group Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines. The ESIA scope, as we refer to IFCPS, is usually wider than most Asian regulatory regimes and have more expectation on consultation and disclosure. Specific requirements for high-risk activity, which are also relevant to Taiwan, include PS5, livelihood restoration, and PS6, impacts on biodiversity. List 1. So many Taiwan projects require project financing from Equator Principal Finance Institute. So that's why they have to assess the ENS management system against EP. So although Taiwan EIA is done, there's still a difference between Taiwan EIA and international DSIA required under the EP. So the gaps, I mean, the difference include, of course, the language, which is, Chinese versus usually English for international ESIA. The assessment process and standard, and scope and coverage. There are some common gaps from the Equator Principle and IFC Performance Standard, including the one I list here. The first 3 are related to biodiversity, and the last 2, social baseline and fisherman livelihood restoration program, are related to social impacts. I'm going to talk further only for the biodiversity ones, which I have been the focus of my presentation. Next one. So comparing Taiwan EIA to international ESIA, for biodiversity, the gaps are mainly on inadequate impact assessment on birds and marine mammal, as I've mentioned previously for EIA. They also only look at their own project impacts, while IFC PS1 require cumulative impact assessment that also take into account impacts of concurrent projects nearby. For offshore wind, meaning adjacent wind farm project. And due to the presence of Taiwanese white dolphin, best bay spoonbill, etc., I mean, it is very likely to trigger critical habitat according to IFC PS6, which is not assessed in Taiwan EIA, and the corresponding requirement of having biodiversity action plan to achieve net gain of critical habitat affected is absent. So gaps need to be closed, and the best approach to close it is to undertake a comprehensive screening and scoping exercise to confirm the gaps and to conduct focused supplementary assessment, including the one I list here: cumulative impact assessment, critical habitat assessment, biodiversity action plan, etc. So that is essential to meet EP4 requirement, and developers may consider to undertake this assessment earlier, so that because these are good findings, right? The findings can be used to supplement the local EIA, which I have mentioned, it is inadequate. Next one. Okay, so I have talked a lot. So my last slide about the key takeaway from my session. So you need an approved EIA to be qualified for the common option. Schedule is tight, and you have to have proper health and safety planning to make sure that your survey can be complete safely and timely. You need to have robust impact assessment relevant to the wind sector to justify adequacy and feasibility of your mitigation measures for approval, and to avoid overcommitment of mitigation that may affect the time and cost of your delivery or even the technical feasibility. Maximize the design envelope as early as possible to avoid, or if unavoidable, reduce time required for potential EDA during your implementation. You can also consider project financing requirement earlier, for example, on biodiversity, to bring in good practice in the local EIA, which would help to address stakeholder concern for the EIA approval. That's it for me today. Thank you very much. I would hand over to Sean again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jovi. Appreciate very much your presentation there. We're going to go now to 2 polling questions again, more focused on the technical and environmental side. But I would like to ask everyone, if here's your last chance to ask any sort of question. We've got 15 minutes to go. If we don't get, we've got some questions. If we can finish early, but if you have any questions, please type them out now and I'll read them out and our people will answer those questions. So this first question, or first of the last 2 questions, what do you think is the biggest challenge in delivery of offshore wind in Taiwan? I'm going to think, I think one of those stands out more than others, but we'll see. Yes, supply chain, I think, was always going to come up as one of the issues, and site conditions, that's consistent. Site conditions is consistent across the other webinars as well. So thanks for those who answered. And we'll go on to our last polling question. In this one, you can pick up to you can pick 3 of your environmental and social concerns. Then we will go on to some questions and a final wrap-up. I hope people were listening to you, Jovi, because you certainly emphasized some of these issues in your presentation. Okay, here we go. We've got a number of answers here. Fishery in opposition, fishing institutions, issues associated with offshore wind. This is again consistent across Korea and Japan, the surveys and webinars that we did. Migratory birds and marine mammals as well. Okay. Now I'll ask the panelists to come back on to video. We still have time for a last question from you, but I'll start off with the ones that we have had asked. And the first one is probably Laura can answer this one. What is the biggest challenge with localization policy?
So I think for me, the single biggest challenge is going to be around the vessels. So Taiwan has restricted the use of China-built vessels and China-flagged vessels, but is also now starting to extend that to foreign vessels more generally, because a lot of the local ship owners and operators had actually started to complain that foreign vessels were being used in place of local vessels. However, from a developer's perspective, the developers aren't convinced that the local vessels have the correct specifications that are required for installation, construction, surveys. So there's a bit of a difference of opinion in terms of vessels, and also the local vessels are very expensive. So I think it's one of these issues that remains to be resolved. And as I said before, there are some workarounds where if it can be proved that foreign vessels that local vessels cannot be used and that there's no alternative local vessel available, the authorities will approve the use of a foreign vessel, but a process has to be followed to eliminate all of the local options in the first instance. And of course, that adds time, delays, money to these projects. So for me, I think it's the vessel issue is the main issue.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Another question, and this is probably for Wen, and is zero bidding likely to happen, is the question.
Yeah, I think everyone will like to win. And the competition is so intense. So if somebody already secured their CPPA, their power procurement with the potential off-taker, that which means they have really great initiative to just submit at zero because they already secured their return for their project. But this only happened is only at least one CPPA be signed, and they can go into, and they will be kind of following by others.
Okay, thank you very much. We've just got one more question today, and so it is likely that we're going to finish a few minutes early. If anybody has another quick question, feel free to type it up quickly. But the last question we have is, it's to Jovi, regarding, besides environmental risk, which you've gone into a lot of detail about, what are the social risks associated with offshore wind in Taiwan? Maybe you could prioritize some of the biggest social risks.
Yep, thank you, Sean. I mean, from the pool result, many people already point out the biggest social risk there. I mean, which is the impact to fishery. So it's like, during the construction and operation of the wind farm project, access to fishing ground gonna be restricted. And also, for the offshore wind farm, although they are located offshore, their subsea cable will be connected to the Taiwan main island, which means that it will cause some designated fishing zone, which is in near shore Taiwan waters. So as a result, that will cause impacts to the fishery, and you will have to communicate and get agreement with the local fishery association for your project. You have to pay compensation, agree on the compensation for your project before your construction started. It's actually a government-led process. They got formula to calculate the compensation. What we understand is that the actual compensation paid is usually more than that's calculated in the formula. So that's for the kind of like Taiwan regulations. And if you look at the IFCPS 5 requirement, which is relevant to livelihood restoration. So they consider this restriction to fishing area as a livelihood impact, and according to the international standard, compensation is not the only requirement. They have to restore the livelihood of the fishermen to the pre-impact level, and they also need to take care of all the potentially affected people. So Taiwan regulations only look at vessel owners, but according to IFCPS 5, you will also look at the fishery workers who don't own the vessels. You have to plan your project. You have to have a livelihood restoration plan so that you provide measures to help to restore their, let's say, livelihood standard. So that's it. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jovi. We do have another question coming, but could we just go to the next slide before I read it out? And if you could just scan the code, this is a survey to give us some feedback on our webinar. If you have the chance to do that while I'm going through the last question and our panel answers it, that would be much appreciated. So the last question is asking about the price level of CPPA, Corporate Power Purchase Agreement. Is it higher than the wholesale market price? I hope we've got someone who can answer this. Possibly Wen might be able to answer that one.
Yeah, of course. So this is a really good question. Thank you for the question. And of course, it's dependent on the timing. And I can say that currently, because what I mentioned, the anxiety between the developer and off-taker, so the price is a little bit higher, and it's depend on what kind of capacity you are looking for. If you want to take the 500 megawatt, of course you get lower price, but if you only take hundreds and hundreds piece by piece, that you lose your your bargain power. So probably your price will getting higher. But currently, I can confidently say that's a little bit higher than the wholesale market, at least for these 5 years. But it's a huge uncertainty in the future as we have much more renewable energy projects in Taiwan. Probably the price will go down. That's my answer.
Okay, well, we have now come to the end of the questions, and on behalf of everyone from ERM and RCG, I'd like to thank all our panelists and to thank you, the attendees who came along today to this webinar, the fourth and last and best, of course, webinar that we put together. And next slide, please. Just give the contact details there. If you'd like to, obviously you are going to get these slides sent to you with a thank you for joining. The contact details there. If you have further questions or want to talk to any of the people within ERM about the Taiwan offshore wind market, please contact us. So thanks again, and maybe we'll see you on the next one when we decide about what new technology is coming to Taiwan that you might be interested in. Thanks, everyone. I think some music comes on board now.